The morning sun barely touched the stone walls of the palace courtyard. A light fog still clung to the cobblestones. Everything seemed quiet. Too quiet. Guard Daniel Morrison stood at his post near the east gate. His boots polished to perfection, his rifle held firm against his shoulder. He'd been standing there for 43 minutes without moving a single inch. That's what the job required. That's what honor demanded. He heard the footsteps before he saw. Her sharp, deliberate, the kind of walk that expected the world to part like water queen. Consort Camilla appeared around the corner, flanked by 2 attendants. Her expression was cold, her eyes scanning the courtyard like a general surveying troops. She wore a navy coat with gold buttons that caught the light. Everything about her posture screamed authority. Daniel's heart rate didn't change. He'd trained for this. He'd stood before royalty dozens of times. Protocol was clear. Respect was mandatory. But so were the rules. Camilla's eyes locked onto him. She stopped walking. The attendants froze behind her. Glancing nervously at each other, "You," she said, her voice cutting through the silence like glass. "Salute me now." Daniel's jaw tightened, but his face remained stone. He didn't move. The fog seemed to grow thicker. One of the attendants whispered something, but Camilla raised her hand sharply, silencing her. She took 3 steps closer to Daniel, close enough that he could see the irritation flashing in her eyes. "I said salute," she repeated, slower this time, each word deliberate. "I am your queen consort. You will show me the respect I am owed." Daniel's fingers flexed slightly against his rifle. His mind raced through the regulations he'd memorized years ago. The King's Guard Manual, Section 4, Paragraph 12. A guardsman on ceremonial duty may only break stance under direct threat. Or explicit command from a superior officer of the guard. Camilla was not his superior officer. She was royal. Yes. She deserved respect, absolutely. But the rules didn't bend. Not even for her. "Ma'am," Daniel said, his voice calm but firm, "I cannot break my post without orders from my commanding officer." The air seemed to freeze. Camilla's face flushed red. Her hands curled into fists at her sides. "Excuse me?" One of the attendants stepped forward nervously. "Your Majesty, perhaps we should be quiet," Camilla snapped, not taking her eyes off Daniel. This guard just refused a direct order from royalty. Daniel's heart pounded now, but his expression didn't change. He could feel eyes on him. Other guards had noticed. Staff members had paused in doorways. Windows above the courtyard held curious faces. This moment was about to define something. He just didn't know what yet. Camilla leaned in slightly, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Do you have any idea what happens to guards who disrespect the crown?" Daniel met her gaze without flinching. "Ma'am, I mean no disrespect. But I follow the regulations I swore to uphold, before you find out what happens next. Make sure you're subscribed and hit that notification bell because this story takes a turn nobody saw coming." Camilla straightened, her face a mask of fury. She pulled out her phone with shaking hands and pressed a number. When someone answered, her voice was ice. "Get me the captain of the guard immediately." She didn't lower the phone. She kept her eyes locked on Daniel, a cold smile forming on her lips. "You've just ended your career, young man," she said softly. "I hope your pride was worth it." Daniel said nothing. He simply returned to attention, eyes forward. Rifle perfectly positioned. But inside, his mind was screaming one question. What have I just done? Captain Richard Ashford arrived within 3 minutes. His boots echoed against the stone as he crossed the courtyard, his face unreadable beneath his peaked cap. He was a man in his 50s, with gray at his temples and 3 decades of service behind him. He stopped precisely 5 feet from where Camilla stood, came to attention, and saluted crisply. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice neutral. "You requested my presence?" Camilla's finger shot toward Daniel like a weapon. This guard refused to salute me. He was insubordinate, disrespectful, and defiant. I want him removed from his post immediately and formally reprimanded. Captain Ashford's eyes flicked to Daniel for just a moment. Daniel remained perfectly still, staring straight ahead. "May I ask the circumstances, Your Majesty?" Ashford asked carefully. "The circumstances?" Camilla's voice rose slightly. "I gave him a direct order. He refused. That's the circumstance." Ashford nodded slowly. He walked over to Daniel, his footsteps measured. He stopped beside him, close enough to speak quietly. "Guard Morrison," he said, his voice low. "Report," Sir Daniel replied, eyes still forward. "I was ordered to salute while on ceremonial guard duty. I informed Her Majesty that regulations prevent breaking stance without command from a guard officer. I intended no disrespect, sir." Ashford was silent for a long moment. The courtyard felt like it was holding its breath. Then he turned back to Camilla. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, "Guard Morrison is correct. King's Guard regulations, established in 1836 and upheld through every reign since, prohibit ceremonial guards from breaking stance except under specific circumstances. This regulation exists to maintain the integrity and discipline of the guard." Camilla's eyes widened. "Are you seriously telling me that a rule written nearly 200 years ago is more important than showing respect to the Queen Consort?" "I'm saying, ma'am, that the guard was following his oath." Ashford's voice remained respectful, but firm. An oath that every guardsman swears to uphold, regardless of circumstance. "His oath is to the crown," Camilla shot back. "I am part of that crown. With respect, Your Majesty, his oath is to the regulations that govern the crown's protection. If guards broke stance for every royal who passed, the entire system would collapse. These rules exist for a reason."
Oh.
Camilla stared at him, her face flushing deeper. "So you're defending his disrespect?" "I'm defending his duty, ma'am." The silence that followed was suffocating. One of the attendants shifted nervously. Somewhere in the distance, a bird called out. Daniel could feel sweat beginning to form under his collar, but he didn't move. "Couldn't move?" Camilla's voice dropped to something cold and dangerous. "Captain Ashford, I want to be very clear. If this guard is not disciplined, I will take this matter directly to the king." Ashford didn't flinch. "That is your right, Your Majesty. You're willing to risk your career over this. I'm willing to uphold the standards that have defined this guard for centuries." "Yes, ma'am." Camilla's hands trembled slightly. She looked between Ashford and Daniel, her expression shifting from anger to something else. Calculation, perhaps? Or a realization that this wasn't going to end the way she expected. "Fine," she said finally, her voice tight. "We'll see what the king has to say about this." She turned sharply and walked away, her attendant scrambling to follow. Her footsteps echoed across the courtyard until she disappeared through an arched doorway. The moment she was gone, the tension didn't break, shifted. Ashford turned slowly to face Daniel. For the first time, Daniel saw something in his captain's eyes. Not anger. Not approval either. Concern. "Morrison," Ashford said quietly, "you just put both of us in a very difficult position." "I know, sir. Do you?" Ashford stepped closer. "The Queen Consort doesn't forget. And she doesn't forgive. You may have followed the rules, but rules don't always protect you from consequences." Daniel's throat went dry. "What happens now, sir?" Ashford glanced toward where Camilla had disappeared. When he looked back, his expression was grim. Now we wait. And we hope that honor still means something in this palace." He walked away, leaving Daniel alone at his post. The fog had lifted completely. The courtyard was bright with morning sun, but Daniel felt colder than he had all day. By noon, the entire palace was talking about it. Daniel could feel it in the way staff members glanced at him as they passed, the way other guards gave him tight nods of solidarity or avoided his eyes entirely. News traveled fast in a place like this, especially when it involved royalty and conflict. He completed his 4-hour shift without incident. When his replacement arrived, a younger guard named Peters. The handoff was silent except for the required verbal confirmation. But Peters whispered something as Daniel stepped away.
Bye.
"Everyone's on your side, mate. Just so you know." Daniel nodded but said nothing. He walked toward the guardhouse, his body aching from standing so long. His mind exhausted from replaying the confrontation over and over. Inside the guardhouse, Several off-duty guards sat around a worn wooden table. The conversation stopped the moment Daniel entered. Sergeant Hayes, broad-shouldered man with 20 years of service, stood up. "Morrison, you all right?" "Yes, Sergeant." Hayes studied him for a moment, then gestured to an empty chair. "Sit, you look like you need it." Daniel sat gratefully. Someone pushed a cup of tea toward him. He wrapped his hands around it, grateful for the warmth. "What you did out there," Hayes said slowly, "took guts. But you know you've painted a target on your back, right?" "I didn't have a choice, Sergeant. The regulations." "I know the regulations." Hayes leaned back in his chair. "Hell, every man in this room knows them. But knowing them and enforcing them against the Queen Consort are two very different things." She wasn't asking him to abandon his post. Another guard, Thompson, chimed in. She just wanted a salute. Was that really worth all this? Daniel's jaw tightened. It's not about the salute. It's about the principle. If we break the rules for one person, where does it stop? What happens the next time someone demands something that goes against regulations? He's right, Hayes said firmly. The moment we start bending for convenience, we stop being the King's Guard and become someone's personal decorations. Thompson shook his head. Principle doesn't pay the bills when you're dismissed from service. The room fell quiet. Hayes broke the silence. Morrison, you should know there's talk that Camilla's already spoken to the king. Word is, she's demanding your removal. Not just from your post, but from the guard entirely. Daniel's stomach dropped. On what grounds? Insubordination, disrespect, embarrassing the crown in front of staff. Hayes shrugged. She doesn't need much. If the king sides with her... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Daniel set down his tea, his hands steady despite the fear creeping through his chest. If that's what happens, then that's what happens. I did my duty. I followed my oath. That's all any of us can do. Hayes smiled slightly, a sad, knowing expression. You remind me of someone I used to know. Young guard, full of ideals. Stood up to a senior royal once. Insisted on following procedure over politics. What happened to him? Hayes's smile faded. He was reassigned. Sent to a remote post in Scotland. Never made it past corporal, he paused. But he could look at himself in the mirror every day. That's worth something. Before Daniel could respond, the door to the guardhouse swung open. An officer in formal dress stood in the doorway, his face expressionless. Guard Morrison. You're to report to the king's private study immediately. The room went silent. Daniel stood slowly, his heart hammering. Understood, sir. The officer turned and left without another word. Daniel grabbed his cap from the table. His hands didn't shake, but it took effort. Hayes stood and clasped his shoulder. Remember who you are, Morrison. Remember why you're here. And no matter what happens in that room, you hold your head high. Daniel nodded. He walked to the door, then paused and looked back at the guards around the table. These men, some he'd served with for years. Others he barely knew all. Watched him with expressions ranging from worry to respect. Thank you, he said. Simply, then he stepped outside and followed the officer toward the private wing of the palace. Each step felt heavier than the last. The king's private study was in the oldest part of the palace. Down corridors lined with portraits of monarchs long dead, each painting seemed to watch Daniel as he passed, their eyes following him with judgment or curiosity. The officer stopped before a heavy oak door. He knocked twice. A voice from inside, calm and measured, said, "Enter." The officer opened the door and gestured for Daniel to step through. Daniel walked into the study. The king sat behind a large desk, covered in papers and leather-bound books. He looked up as Daniel entered, his expression unreadable. Daniel came to attention immediately, saluting with precision despite the fear coursing through him. Your Majesty? King Charles gestured to a chair across from his desk. Please, sit down, Guard Morrison. Daniel hesitated. Royalty rarely invited guards to sit, but he obeyed. The chair was surprisingly comfortable, which somehow made him more nervous. The king removed his reading glasses and set them carefully on the desk. For a long moment, he simply looked at Daniel, studying him the way someone might examine a puzzle. "Do you know why you're here?" the king asked finally. "I believe so, Your Majesty. The incident this morning with the queen consort?" "Incident." Charles repeated the word thoughtfully. Yes, Camilla described it quite differently. She used words like humiliation and blatant disrespect. Daniel's throat felt tight. "Your Majesty, I meant no disrespect." The king raised a hand, silencing him gently. "Let me ask you something, Morrison. How long have you served in the King's Guard?" 6 years, Your Majesty. "In those 6 years, have you ever refused an order before?" "No, sir. Never." "Not once?" "Never, Your Majesty." Charles leaned back in his chair. "Then why today? Why this order from my wife, in front of witnesses and staff?" Daniel took a breath. This was the moment. Everything depended on how he answered. "Your Majesty, I was on ceremonial guard duty. The regulations are clear that a guardsman in that position cannot break stance without orders from a guard officer. I didn't refuse the Queen Consort's order out of disrespect. I refused because following it would have violated the oath I swore when I joined the guard." "An oath to me," Charles said quietly. "An oath to the crown, sir, and to the principles that the guard represents. Discipline, duty, honor. If I had broken stance for personal convenience, even at a royal request, I would have betrayed everything the guard stands for." The king was silent. His fingers drummed once on the desk, a soft rhythm that seemed to echo in the quiet study. "Camilla believes you should be dismissed," he said finally. "She feels that you embarrassed her publicly, and that allowing you to remain in service would undermine respect for the royal family." Daniel's heart sank, but he kept his expression neutral. "I understand, Your Majesty, do you?" Charles leaned forward slightly. "Do you understand what you've put me in the middle of, Morrison? I have a wife who feels disrespected and humiliated. I have a guard tradition that goes back centuries. I have regulations written by my ancestors. And I have one young guard who chose principle over politics." He paused, his eyes searching Daniel's face. "Tell me something honestly. If you could go back to this morning, knowing what it would cost you, would you make the same choice?" Daniel didn't hesitate. "Yes, Your Majesty, even if it means the end of your career." "Even then, sir, because if I had broken that oath once, it would mean nothing the next time, and the time after that. A man's word is all he truly has." Charles sat back again, a slight smile crossing his face. It wasn't a happy smile. It was something sadder, more complicated. "My mother," he said quietly, "Queen Elizabeth once told me something I've never forgotten. She said that the crown doesn't exist because of power or wealth or even bloodline. It exists because people believe in it, and they believe in it because we uphold certain standards, certain principles, even when it's inconvenient." He picked up a paper from his desk. Daniel recognized it as a guard regulation document. "These rules you followed this morning? They were written by my great-great-great-grandfather, King William IV. He created them because he understood something important. That discipline and consistency matter more than any individual's pride, even royal pride." Daniel barely dared to breathe. Charles set the paper down. "My wife is hurt, she's angry. And she has every right to feel that way, because from her perspective, she was publicly defied." But he stood up, walking around the desk to stand beside Daniel. Daniel immediately started to rise, but the king gestured for him to remain seated. "But the truth is, Morrison, you did exactly what you should have done. You followed your training. You upheld your oath, and you did it with respect even when it cost you dearly." Daniel's throat tightened. He didn't trust himself to speak. Charles put a hand on his shoulder. "I'm not going to dismiss you. I'm not even going to reprimand you. What I am going to do is have a difficult conversation with my wife about the difference between disrespect and duty, Your Majesty. I don't want to cause problems between you. Didn't cause anything, Morrison. This situation was created by a misunderstanding of roles and regulations. It's my job to clarify that, not yours." He walked back around his desk and sat down, his expression becoming formal again. "You'll return to your regular duties. Captain Ashford will be informed that no disciplinary action is being taken. However, he paused meaningfully. I would suggest you avoid any further interactions with the Queen Consort for a while. Give this situation time to cool. Of course, Your Majesty. Charles picked up his glasses, signaling the meeting was over. But just as Daniel stood to leave, the king spoke again. Morrison. One more thing? Yes, sir? Thank you for reminding me that honor still matters more than convenience. The guard needs men like you. Daniel left the king's study, feeling like his legs might give out beneath him. The officer who'd escorted him there stood waiting in the corridor, his expression carefully neutral. You're dismissed, Morrison. Return to your quarters? Yes, sir. Daniel walked through the palace corridors in a daze. He'd expected dismissal. He'd prepared himself for the end of everything he'd worked for. Instead, the king had thanked him, but the relief was short-lived. As he turned a corner near the East Gallery, he nearly collided with someone. He stepped back quickly, an apology already forming on his lips, then froze. Queen Consort Camilla stood before him. They were alone in the corridor. No attendants, no guards. Just the two of them in a space suddenly too small. Camilla's face was unreadable. Not angry like this morning. Not anything really, just ... Watching him, Daniel came to attention immediately. Your Majesty? My apologies, I didn't you one, she said quietly. Daniel blinked. Ma'am, don't play innocent. Charles told me his decision. You keep your position. No reprimand. No consequences. Her voice was soft, but there was something sharp underneath it. You must feel very proud of yourself. I feel relieved, Your Majesty. Nothing more, relieved. She took a step closer. Do you have any idea what you did to me this morning? In front of staff, in front of other guards? You made me look foolish. You made me look like I don't understand how things work here. Daniel's chest tightened. That was never my intention. Your intention doesn't matter. The result is what matters. And the result is that the entire palace is talking about how the Queen Consort was put in her place by a guard. She wasn't shouting. Somehow that made it worse. I didn't want this, Daniel said quietly. I was just following the regulations. Yes, I know. Charles explained it all very thoroughly. How I should have known better. How I should understand the traditions. How these rules are sacred and untouchable. Her eyes were bright, but not with tears. With something harder. Do you know what it's like to be constantly told you don't belong? That you don't understand? That you're not ... enough? Daniel didn't know how to respond to that. Camilla took a breath, composing herself. When she spoke again, her voice was steadier. I've spent years trying to earn respect in this family. Years of public scrutiny, criticism, comparison to someone who can never be replaced. And every time I think I've finally found my footing, something like this happens to remind me that I'll always be the outsider, Your Majesty. I'm not telling you this for sympathy, she interrupted. I'm telling you this so you understand what your principle cost. Yes, you followed your rules. Yes, you upheld your oath. But you also humiliated someone who spent her entire life fighting to be taken seriously. Daniel felt something crack in his chest. He'd been so focused on the regulations, on doing things correctly, that he hadn't considered how it might feel from her perspective. I'm sorry, he said, and meant it. I truly am. Not for following the regulations, I can't apologize for that, but for any pain it caused you. That was never what I wanted. Camilla studied him for a long moment. Something in her expression shifted, softened, just slightly. Do you know what Charles said to me after you left his study? She asked. He said that you reminded him why he still believes in tradition. That young men like you give him hope for the institution. She smiled, but it was sad. He's right, of course. You're exactly the kind of guard the crown needs. Principled, unbending, loyal to something bigger than yourself. But principles have a cost, Morrison. Remember that? She stepped past him, then stopped. For what it's worth, she said without turning around, I don't think you're a bad person. I think you're a young man who believes in something. That's actually quite rare these days. Then she walked away, her footsteps echoing down the corridor. Daniel stood frozen for several minutes after she disappeared. He'd won, yes. He'd kept his position. He'd upheld his principles. But somehow, it didn't feel like victory. It felt complicated and messy and human. He made his way back to the guardhouse slowly. When he entered, the room erupted in quiet celebration. Hayes clapped him on the back. Thompson offered him a beer despite it being only mid-afternoon. Others gathered around, asking questions, wanting details, but Daniel felt distant from it all. He'd done the right thing. He was sure of that, so why did he feel so empty? That night, alone in his quarters, Daniel sat on his bunk and stared at the uniform hanging on his wall. The pristine red coat, the gleaming buttons, the symbols of everything he'd worked for. He thought about Camilla's words, about the cost of principles, about the difference between being right and being kind. Could he have handled it differently? Should he have? He didn't know. What he did know was that duty was rarely simple. Honor wasn't always clean, and sometimes doing the right thing meant hurting people you never intended to hurt. He fell asleep that night with no easy answers. 3 weeks passed. Daniel returned to his regular rotation, standing guard at various posts throughout the palace grounds. The story of his confrontation with the queen consort had spread beyond the palace walls. News articles appeared. Social media debates raged. Opinion pieces were written about tradition versus modernity. Daniel ignored all of it. He did his duty. He followed his training, and he tried not to think too much about what had happened. Then came a morning ceremony in the palace gardens. It was a charity event hosted by the queen consort, something to do with literacy programs for underprivileged children. Daniel was assigned to security detail, standing at the perimeter of the garden while cameras flashed and dignitaries mingled. He didn't expect Camilla to notice him. There were dozens of guards present, but halfway through the event, as she was greeting a line of charity representatives, she glanced over. Their eyes met briefly. Daniel remained at attention, expression neutral. Camilla said something to an attendant, then broke away from the reception line. She walked directly toward him. Daniel's pulse quickened, but he didn't move. She stopped a few feet away, close enough to speak without being overheard, but far enough to maintain proper distance. "Guard Morrison," she said formally. "Your Majesty." She looked at him for a moment, then did something unexpected. She smiled. It wasn't forced or polite. It was genuine. "I wanted to tell you something," she said quietly. "After what happened between us, I spent a lot of time thinking. About tradition. About rules. About what this institution means and how I fit into it." Daniel listened, unsure where this was going. "I was angry with you," she continued. "Furious, actually. But Charles helped me understand something. You weren't trying to disrespect me. You were trying to protect something bigger than both of us. The integrity of the guard. The trust people place in these institutions." She paused, glancing back at the ceremony before returning her attention to Daniel. "I'm not saying I was wrong to feel hurt, but I was wrong to make it personal. You were doing your job, and it's a job that matters." She took a breath. "So I wanted to thank you for reminding me that these traditions exist for a reason, and for showing me that respect for the crown isn't about power or privilege. It's about principles worth defending." Daniel was speechless. This was the last thing he'd expected. "I don't need you to respond," Camilla said gently. "I just wanted you to know that I understand now. What you did that morning, it wasn't easy, and it cost you something, but it mattered." She started to turn away, then stopped. "Oh, and Morrison, the next time I see you on ceremonial duty, I won't ask for a salute." She smiled slightly. "I'll save that for when you're off duty. If you'd be willing to grant me that courtesy?" Daniel felt something loosen in his chest. "It would be my honor, Your Majesty." She nodded once, then walked back to the ceremony, slipping seamlessly back into her role. Daniel remained at his post, but something had shifted. The weight he'd been carrying for weeks, the doubt, the guilt, the complicated feelings, it was lighter now. He hadn't been wrong to follow the regulations, but Camilla hadn't been wrong to feel hurt either. They'd both been protecting something important. Her dignity, his duty. And somehow, in the weeks since that confrontation, they'd both learned something about the other. That evening, Captain Ashford called Daniel into his office. "You've caused me more gray hairs in 3 weeks than I've gotten in 3 years, Ashford said, but he was smiling. "Sorry, sir. Don't be. You did something remarkable, Morrison. You reminded this entire palace that rules aren't obstacles, they're foundations. And you did it with grace under pressure." He leaned back in his chair. "I'm recommending you for promotion. Corporal, if you're interested." "Sir, I don't you do. You've earned it. Not just because of what happened with the Queen Consort, but because of how you handled everything after. You didn't gloat. You didn't use it for attention. You just kept doing your duty with dignity." Ashford stood and extended his hand. "The Guard needs more men like you, Corporal Morrison." Daniel shook his hand, feeling pride swell in his chest for the first time since this all began. 6 months later, Daniel was standing guard at a state dinner. Royalty from across Europe had gathered for a formal reception. Protocol was tight, security was intense, and every guard was expected to be perfect. Daniel stood at his assigned post near the entrance to the banquet hall, at attention, unmoving. King Charles passed by with a group of dignitaries, then paused and turned back. He approached Daniel, causing several security personnel to tense slightly. "Corporal Morrison," the king said warmly. "Good to see you, Your Majesty." Daniel's voice was steady. Charles smiled slightly, then did something that made several people nearby gasp quietly. He saluted Daniel. A king saluting a guard. It was brief, casual even, but the gesture spoke volumes. "Carry on, Corporal," Charles said, then continued into the banquet hall. Daniel remained at attention, but inside his heart was soaring. He'd done the right thing that morning in the courtyard. He'd upheld his oath, defended his principles, and paid the cost for both. And in the end, he'd earned something more valuable than approval. He'd earned respect. The night continued. Guests arrived and departed. Music played from inside the banquet hall, and Daniel stood at his post unwavering, a symbol of duty and honor in a world that desperately needed both. As the evening drew to a close, Camilla emerged from the banquet hall. She saw Daniel, smiled warmly, and offered him the smallest nod of acknowledgement. He nodded back. No words were needed. They understood each other now, and that understanding, that hard-won mutual respect, was worth more than any salute ever could be. Daniel's story spread through the guard, told 2 new recruits, as an example of what it meant to serve with honor. Not because he'd defied royalty, but because he'd understood something fundamental, that duty sometimes requires difficult choices, and the right choice isn't always the easy one. Years later, when Daniel had become a training officer himself, he would tell young guards gathering for their first day, "You will face moments that test you. Moments where doing the right thing feels impossible. Remember that honor isn't about being comfortable. It's about being consistent. It's about standing firm when the world tells you to bend." And he would think of that foggy morning in the courtyard when a simple moment of duty became something much more profound. A reminder that principles matter. That tradition has value. And that respectual respect is earned through courage, consistency, and the willingness to pay the cost of doing what's right.